Today on the Kuvio Caller.
You know, like you have a vague idea of the direction you want to go, but then it's like each door you open then has another like 100 doors, and you've got to find it's like Takeshi's Castle.
Yeah. I chat with Kieran Parker, our director of design, on all things branding and the benefits and perils of imposter syndrome.
Hey, excited to have our first recording session.
Yeah.
We do this every week, so it's finally good to get our thoughts down digitally.
Yeah, so you've been with us for how long? A year and a half now? 2 years?
I think just over 2 years, to be honest.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So Kuvio as a company has been in business for just over 3 years now. I started it with a designer that I'd worked with for a long time, but about a year in, he decided to go separate ways. But right before that, he found Kieran, who has been kind of our right-hand person ever since, and we've been having these weekly brainstorming meetings ever since. Every single one of them I just freaking love, because they become the sort of coalescing together of all of the crazy ideas that we have all the time, and they're always super, super interesting.
Yeah, and we always joked that we should start writing these down, because we tend to talk for what's supposed to be 30 minutes to an hour, and sometimes they last 4 or 5.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. So get ready for the first 4 to 5 hour podcast that you've ever listened to.
We'll try and cut it down, but I'm sure it'll be a bit hard.
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting, you know. So when I joined as a sort of secondary designer, and you the first time I heard from you directly was whilst I was on holiday, and I think you messaged me on Slack, or you might have even emailed me saying, "Hey, really need to talk to you. Let me know when you're back." And obviously in my mind I was like, "Oh God, what have I done wrong?" sort of thing. And then it's just like, yeah, so how do you feel about being our full-time designer? And then it just sort of went full gear from then. So
were you working part-time basically before that, or part-time?
Before that I think I was doing a couple hours here, a couple hours there, all through the other designer. They kind of just sent me some work, and I was just doing bits and bobs, they're setting direct tasks, and I was working on it, and then I'd send it to them, and they'd put it back through to you. I remember I sat in on one meeting with the team, but I didn't speak.
And really, the very first time that you ever heard from me was me going, "Hey, you want to?"
Yeah,
crazy.
Which is why it's so concerning. I was like, "Oh God, why is it gone? Why is it kind of skipped the normal flow? It must be really bad."
Yeah.
But yeah, I was on holiday in Portugal, and I remember I had no internet on my phone, so I went and sat in a KFC to use the internet, and then I got an email through. I was like, "Oh, okay, that was lucky."
Yeah, that's crazy. That's been so long ago. It feels like I was 12 when that happened.
I think it's been 2 years October, I think, that I went full time.
Yeah,
and I must have been working a couple months before then. But yeah, so the point of this podcast, I guess, is just to sort of talk about topics we've thought about over the week, right? Challenges that through our work, or what we've sort of thought about outside of work, stuff like that. So my first topic to get the ball rolling, as you know, Joseph, I'm obviously working on a branding project at the moment, which will turn into, a whole website, branding collateral, the whole sort of works. And the challenges that come with that obviously are different from client to client, but luckily this client, which is Better Growth, have given us complete creative freedom and complete trust, which comes with its own challenges, because with complete freedom comes endless possibilities. And I'm sure any designer, most people in the sort of creative space probably suffer from perfectionism as well. Not to say that I'm a perfectionist, but you're always trying to strive for the best you can do. So, with that, you want to try and understand what the client wants best. And it's hard because sometimes they don't quite know exactly what they want. They have all these different ideas, and you've got to try and grab the best ideas and see how you can merge them together and sort of take what they're saying and read between the lines. I think, when we brainstormed this, you sort of come across the idea of a couple of their keywords kind of sounded a bit rebellious, as if they wanted that sort of rebellious vibe, which I really kind of picked up on, and agreed with. So over the past couple of weeks, I've been slowly working on branding, but it just takes such a long time because branding is so subjective that, you know, it varies from project to project. One project, you might get the right idea right away, which I think kind of happened with Photos of Us. I think I got it for like a week or two. Whereas this one, whilst I haven't actively been working on it for like a month or so, it's been in the back of my mind for a month or so, and it still hasn't quite clicked 100%. But the problem is, obviously, I've been focusing on the logo, and a brand is more than the logo itself. But I have all these ideas in my head, but it's hard to move past the logo and get onto the brand to sort of express the brand whilst you're kind of still stuck on the logo. You know, there's this endless cycle, which I think you pointed out the other day, which is I'm showing them the logo and they're not quite latching on the same way we have, but that's because they have no context. They don't know what's going on in the discussions or in my head. So today I moved on to sort of, you know, business cards and a little bit of sort of ignoring the logo. So essentially the logo idea is there, and there's some variations still, like, you know, colors are not final, the actual iconography of the logo isn't final, but the idea of the logo is there, whether it's going to be a letter or a symbol or whatever. But the idea is that it's this sort of rebellious glitch logo that's just really bold and sort of screams energy. So moving forward with them sort of ideas, I was able to sort of make these business card examples. And straight away, I realized how blind I was being stuck in this logo loop, because just doing 4 examples of these business cards has allowed me to express the brand in such a way that now I'm starting to doubt myself as the brand before isn't even the brand that's today. You know, it's changed so much with just 4 examples that, yes, branding is this weird thing where you kind of just get stuck in your own head and it's hard to move on. But
it's also an entirely creative process, right? I mean, we've had clients in the past that, and almost every client is like this, and I don't blame them for this, but the kind of common notion of the way of approaching branding always ends up centering for some reason around a logo. Mm-hmm. Which ends up only getting presented, really, in most cases, unless it's stuck on the side of a building, as a little 100 by 100 pixel thing in the top left of a website, right? And as a 100 by 100 pixel thing on the top of a letterhead and on the top of a business card. But there's so much effort that everybody tries to kind of concentrate on that logo being representative of the entire brand that you know, people drive themselves crazy trying to do that, because it's impossible to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the most interesting avenues that I feel like we've always tried to explore instead has been to try to change that conversation to redefine what a brand is, and almost by doing so lessen the importance of that logo, right? I mean, because branding projects, you could spend, you know, people do 3 to 6 months on a logo itself before they even get to the corresponding web design or the marketing assets or anything that kind of relates to that. And they're throwing all of the brand colors and all the styles and all that kind of stuff into this 100 by 100 pixel thing, right? And trying to make it represent everything, but not realizing that there's context outside of it, that it just is nearly infinite in which those other brand ideas can be expressed without necessarily having to latch them inside of the logo. You know, because other people, consumers, right, come in, they're not seeing the story behind that logo. Mm-hmm. And so the logo gives you a story, but that's not what your company should be about, right? Your company should be about the story that the things that you do themselves tell to that consumer, right? And you could have the ugliest logo in the world, but if your process is right and your product is right and all these other things are right, then the logo kind of fades into the distance. But a lot of people try to put so much importance on the logo as though that's the thing that represents the polish, when it's the brand and it's the product and it's everything around it that really represent to me the bulk of the polish.
Yeah, and even though I know all of that sort of stuff as well, sometimes even I fall into the pit of getting stuck in a logo. Like I said, I've been focused on the logo side of the brand so much, because the thing is, whilst the logo, like I said, isn't finished, but it's okay because I have the idea. The logo is almost like the starting point, right? So you want to build up the logo enough to get some good ideas of the direction. Then after moving on to the assets, like further branding today onto different parts, I've realized I've created new assets that aren't part of the logo that I was doing, which I now want to go back and add into the logo and rework it slightly. So it's going to be, it's going to be backwards and forwards probably like 5 or 6 times, because it's still evolving. From the logo that I've got, it's going to evolve the website and the assets, which is going to go back and evolve the logo again.
Right.
Until you go backwards and forwards so many times, you end up at the final piece where they're both as far as they're going to go,
But they're both also teaching each other things, right? And so you're going bottom up, and then you're also going top down, which is, it's so fascinating because it applies directly to architecture as well. There are times in which I'll open something up and I'll be like, okay, what is the high level architecture of this program, right? And I'm thinking in the level of, what is the folder structure of the files that are going to, happen, and how should things be named, and what framework should we use, if we should use any, and all this kind of high level stuff. And I end up getting stuck. So then I'll move off to the entirely opposite side of the spectrum, which is, what does it mean to upload a photo? What's this function going to do whenever you click this button? And somehow that act of moving from one edge to the other, just that function that you write to do something when a consumer clicks a button, starts to flesh out the things that you were unable to flesh out on the other side of the spectrum. And they speak to each other, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what's so interesting about these conversations between you and me, because the same thing happens between design and architecture, right? Like the blocks that we end up hitting, mm-hmm. as soon as we reveal those blocks to each other, those blocks speak to the answer for the other person in almost every single case. And it's always been fascinating to me the way that, even from a creative branding design process, right? The things that came to mind when you were talking about the logo design was exactly the same scenarios that I've been struggling with on the architecture side, as I was trying to construct, one thing on one side of the spectrum. And so the sort of lift up, go to the other side of the spectrum, and architect from the highest level back down, and maybe that'll get the universe to reveal something. Mm-hmm. It's this beautiful sort of, I feel like, natural law of the universe that seems to work out every time at every level. Both internally with our own spectrums, and then across each other, and then across other people of the team as well. Like, the more of those spectrums that you can kind of incorporate, and the more kind of cross communication you can have between those things, the closer you come to that sort of perfect pattern, right? That 100% that you found, which is just super fascinating to me and super hard to explain why that's the case.
Well, it's surprising as well, because before I joined Kuvio, my design, whilst it was like a functional design, it was very minimal and sort of stylistic. Whereas now, you've probably noticed as well that it's slowly turning from that sort of thing to much more of a functional designer. So like I lean more towards, dashboards and stuff, because I like to think how things work and how things will function, whilst also designing the aesthetical side of it. I like to design the functional side, and that's why I think us two talk so much every week, is because I'll be talking about one thing about how things should work, but you're facing exactly the same issues on the other side of the fence, Yeah. So like you said, it just helps in a weird way. We're solving the same problems in the same way. Yeah. It's just we're going about it slightly differently as well.
It's exactly that process that has made me be able to sell this idea that I feel like should be the way that all software is built. Design-driven development. Mm-hmm. Which, 80% of the time I say that sort of phrase to any client, they immediately get what I'm talking about, because the thing that they don't care about is development. Mm-hmm. They don't care what code we type in to do the functions. They care about their user experience. They care about the polish of the application itself. All they're seeing is the user interface, right? But there's always been a disconnect with most software shops where they don't even hire a designer, right? They make the function of the app be its own design, which turns out to just be a bunch of buttons thrown across all the different pages and websites that then they consider done because it's functional. But there's an entire user experience that is actually more important for the end game, it's the product design, right? That's more important than the way that you wrote this function or this other function or this. Or so the way that we kind of have always interacted has produced that sort of really beautiful process, in that you're not only designing something that we came up with from a functional perspective, but you're inventing the functions that are going to exist in the first place. And those inventions, which then come with a design spec and an experience and a user flow, those are the spec that gets passed to the developer. And now the developer has everything that they need, but they have it in a visual form. Mm-hmm. And then it's their job to translate that visual form into code, right? There's something beautiful about that that's entirely inverted from what every other development shop I've ever worked at has done, right? But should be the way that things should work, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that sort of magic of your brain being able to think in that UX mentality that so perfectly overlaps my architectural mentality, that is the thing that makes that happen.
I wonder if it's also because obviously I've had slight interest in learning just the basics of development, like just the very basics. I wonder if that also helps me empathize with the development side, in the same way that you understand the basics of design. There's, because of that slight overlap, we're able to see into each other's world, where I can imagine a designer who has never seen how code is structured or sat down just to hear about it, they may design in such a way that it's not quite functional, right? Like it's functional from their end, but they could learn so much more reading, say, like one coding book than they could through 10 design books in that subject matter,
Yeah. It's almost a triangle, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to talk like a prototypical CEO who has pictures of triangles on their wall of random business terms and stuff. But there is this intersection of visual design, coding architecture, and the actual problem of the client, right? And when those three are sort of in this symbiosis, then that's when magic happens, right? Because there is a problem that is a real problem that can really be solved with design and development, and I feel like 95% of the problems in the world can be solved with the intersection of design and development. But the issue that people run into is that they don't know how to intersect those three things, right? And so the client has their subjective opinions, like you were saying, about logos and about branding and colors and fonts and functionality and all this kind of stuff, right? And they have even more so a subjective opinion than they do about development, just because everybody has an aesthetic opinion about everything, right? Anytime you walk into an art museum, you're going to have I like this, I don't like this, I don't like this doesn't speak to me, but this does. And that's very personal and it's very subjective. But then that's interspersed with, well, you're not the audience, right? Like the general mass consumer is the audience. Mm-hmm. And so it's less about whether it speaks to you and more about what it says to that general audience and how close we can get to that common pattern that actually represents the thing that you're trying to solve and the thing you're trying to do. So when, and Better Growth is a perfect example of this sort of flexibility, when that flexibility is given by a client, to just say, hey, look, we have no idea what we're doing on the design front. We have no idea what we're doing on the development front, but we are the master of our own industry. Mm-hmm. And so we can tell you the problem that we have that we want to solve, but we have no idea where to go to do that, right? That's where we come in, right? And that's where that sort of intersection that we've figured out, and this is the way that the rest of the team works as well, and is the unique way that with the minimum amount of information about an issue that could potentially be solved with technology or with a new brand can immediately be understood and translated into a solution by us and by our team, because we've kind of figured out that it takes a spectrum, right? It takes a look from each one of our own unique angles, but it also takes a combination of all of those things all together that really then, sort of coalesces into that common pattern that just seems seems to be the thing that once it's discovered, everybody across all spectrums goes, that's the one, you know? And that's the magic part, right? And we always end up getting to it, right? But and it's hilarious how the world works, right? You either get to it in 5 minutes, or it takes 6 months, you know, or you never get to it at all, right? How many composers have a million unfinished symphonies? How many artists end up with rooms full of canvases that are half white, right?
Yeah.
But it's that creative process, right? And you're just kind of waiting for that sort of muse to kind of alight on your shoulder, right? And that pattern to be discovered.
Yeah, which is exactly where I sort of am with Better Growth, where I think it's also because of how much freedom there is. The more, like I said, the more freedom in a project, there always seems to be the more possibilities. And I think that's why Better Growth has taken longer than, say, any other one I've worked on recently, simply because there's so many avenues to test out that you've got to test each one to know that it's wrong. You know, like you have a vague idea of the direction you want to go, but then it's like each door you open and has another like 100 doors, and you've got to find it's like Takeshi's Castle. If you've ever watched that. But they just run through a door and then it's like they got another 5 doors and you got to run through another one, and it's just, and I think that's why it helped. Obviously, you said about they're struggling to see the brand because I haven't presented the brand as the brand. I've just presented a logo, which is obvious, and I've known that, but I obviously got stuck in my own head. And working on brand assets earlier today just reduces that amount of doors down, because you can just try it in a totally different area, and then rather than going through one path with 1,000 variations, you're going into another path and waiting for them to cross over.
100%.
And it just works so well. You said something about, obviously, everyone's an artist. Not in quite them words, but I know we spoke about this before. So there was a logo a while ago that was done. I think it was $50,000. I think it was either a state logo or a political logo. I can't remember what it was for. And everyone's tweets were like, my 3-year-old daughter could have drawn that. It wasn't a great logo. I wasn't a huge fan of it. But they're saying it's not worth £50,000 or dollars because it looked amateur. Anyone could have drawn it. But the problem is, not could you draw it, but could you have come to the same conclusion for the same reasons, right?
Right.
Which I think is the thing that people have to keep in mind, or as a designer, what you've got to show off to people, right? So the public might not know, and the public will assume it's a rubbish logo. But if it's got complete meaning and depth, like for example, the Better Growth, I've gone for energetic and bold and loud, and in control, right, and confident. They're the sort of emotions I want to evoke, and as long as that's what they do and that's what they feel represents them, it doesn't matter if the logo looks, and I'm quoting, amateur, because that's sometimes how I see it, because I've made it and I'm like, oh, it's just this circle with a square and a couple other squares. It looks really simple, but it's getting, and then that's where self-doubt comes in. What's it called? Imposter syndrome, right? So I'm like, is this really any good? Like, I've just done it in 10 minutes and it looks pretty simple, but then, I got to remind myself that it's not 10 minutes that it took me to make that single logo. It's the 2 weeks it took me to come to the conclusion, which is what people have to try and take in mind when they're looking at logos, like, I'm trying to think of some logos that have good backstories to it. But, the Slack redesign logo recently, I went and read their case study, and I'm a little bit more sympathetic towards the change. They've got good reason to change it. The last one wasn't. There was kind of 3 or 4 different variations of the Slack logo depending on how it's used, whereas now it's just one across all things. It's better, yeah.
And you're right. I mean, I'm preaching all this stuff about everybody is an artist and everybody should sort of mind their own business. Whereas at the same time, I remember slacking you and going, have you seen this most horrendous logo that's ever been invented by anybody? And I was latching onto the bandwagon of everybody that was losing their mind on Twitter saying, oh my gosh, the same sort of thing. My 3-year-old could make this. This is, but you know what? I mean, it's been 3 weeks now? And that logo has now completely faded into the background for me. And I went back and looked at the previous logo, and the previous logo now looks amateur compared to this. So they did their job, right? And good for them that it seemed like they knew that was coming because they're in such a spotlight. And they went ahead and did it anyway, and they did it without asking, and they did it without fanfare, and they just said, look, here it is. If you are interested in reading a case study behind why, here you go. We know that 99% of you won't, but we also know that 99% of you will adjust within a month. And and
a lot of the initial outcry was personal preference, but also familiarity. So people might still look at two logos and prefer the old one, or they might have had an initial outcry because they were used to the old one. But once you read their reasonings...
And I wonder what that represents, right? Because you're totally right? That feeling is a feeling of the loss of familiarity, which seems like it almost kind of subconsciously translates to, oh my gosh, what the heck else is Slack changing? And this new familiar thing is changing that I don't have control over. What else is changing, right? What else is going to be different? What are they making me do to change myself and adjust myself because they just felt like they wanted to? That's fascinating.
Well, there's a couple there's this website that I go on that's called Brand New, and basically there's a section on there that has people who have old logos and how they've updated them recently. There was a post about a lot of fashion logos being updated, like for example Burberry. They've changed their typography to be a bit more modern, and a lot of people are saying that it's lost its heritage because now it looks like a modern font and it's lost its existing heritage, which I can understand. It has lost a bit of personality.